welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
And your co-host Rich Gear here as well. And Doug, we haven't talked about this book for quite a while, but it's one of the ones you've edited, put together with Dr. Jerry Bergman, called Persuaded by the Evidence. And you picked out four or five stories that you wanted to. There's a lot of good stories in this book. So you know, if you haven't read this or picked up, you want to pick up a copy of it. It's really good. There's also kind of a sequel called Transformed by the Evidence, but Persuaded by the Evidence is really about how people came to a faith, number one, and creation, number two, I guess.
Yeah, all five of these people we're going to talk about tonight were atheists at the time. You know, they were brought up in the school system where they taught only evolution.
Yeah.
And so they figured that was really all there was, and they had no interest in Christianity because they believed in evolution. And yet they started to figure out that something was amiss, and a lot of it had to do with longing in their heart. They had this emptiness in their heart that they needed to know if there was something more than what their current life had to offer. So,
well, how they came to faith, it seemed like there are different stories. Like, as far as I know, Raymond Damadian, which we get down to longer, because we got basically Curt Sewell, John Sanford, David Bradbury, Raymond Damadian, and Frank Sherwin are the ones we like to talk about. But Dr. Damadian, he always? I think he was always a believer, as far as I know.
He told me that he came to Christ through Billy Graham.
Is that right? I guess I think of his heritage because he, is Armenian, or Armenian. Then they had a lot of persecution from their Christian heritage. Mm-hmm. So, all right, well, that's okay, good.
So anyway, we have these two books. This book, Persuaded by the Evidence, was written in 2008, and this was actually a 5-year project. So he started this around 2003 when we.
That was that long ago. Wow.
And so a lot of these stories we've gathered up over those years, and then the sequel to this, Transformed by the Evidence, were additional stories that we gathered in the meantime, and didn't make the first book. But these were unique in the fact that we oriented it towards what changes took place in the people's lives, and it was, it's one thing to be persuaded, and it's another thing to be transformed, and that your life has actually changed as a result of seeing the scientific evidence for creation.
I think that what you put out, we in this why we do the show and why creationists do it, are not telling you that you have to go by evidence to become a believer or whatever. Mm-hmm. But we believe the evidence will corroborate what's already being stirred up in your heart. Revelation really happens. I remember reading an interview years ago, by Isaac Asimov. He goes, "Well, reason and logic are all we have. What are you supposed to do? Revelation?" I said, in reality, to come to faith takes revelation. There's no other real way to get there, because the biblical text is very clear and explicit that the natural man cannot understand the things of the Spirit. You cannot. But
John Sanford had this experience with God. John challenged God. He says, "Show me the evidence and I will believe." But God came back to him and he says, "Believe and I will show you the evidence."
Yeah,
and so that was his whole thing, that he had to actually come to faith and to take this
leap, so to speak.
Take this step and to find out what it was all about. Now, the first one on my list is Curt Sewell.
Okay.
And I don't know if you ever encountered his stuff.
No, I've never. No.
But Curt contacted me, and we exchanged a lot of information. This was very early, about 1998, 2000.
Okay.
And he said that he had all these articles he'd like to put on my website, and so I have all of his, what is called creation bits. And so it's a series of lessons that he ended up teaching in his Sunday school and in his church about creation. But Curt is very unique in that he is a physicist. He was on the Manhattan Project.
Wow.
So he was there at the Trinity site when the first atomic bomb went off.
Is he still alive?
No,
He passed away?
He passed away, but he actually owned a radioisotope dating firm.
Wow.
So his company, you'd send the samples to them, and they would measure the uranium and the lead in the samples, and by that they would come up with a date. Well, one of the things that he figured out was that the reasoning behind it was circular. He says that
Yeah, we've talked about that, but go ahead, yeah.
you know, all these things you have to have, you're actually assuming what you want to prove, and so the results are determined by your assumptions.
And we've known that for years, Doug, because we've, you know, you always hear about, well, if you get too young of a date, they think it's contamination. But there are also times when they get dates that are way too old for what they want. They throw those out as well. But we also talked about all the assumptions you have, you know, whether is it equal amounts of the radioactive thing, or is it all solid uranium, or you know, half lead, half uranium, or half whatever. And all these things are assumptions, and they make the assumptions based on what dates they actually want to arrive at the end. So you're right about the circular reasoning. So he figured that out, huh?
Yeah, he was actually helping to determine what the age of the Earth was. You know, he was trying to get in on that project to figure all that stuff out. And when he realized that it was not based on a sound logic, you know, he started searching elsewhere, and he came to Christ and started to work with, you know, help other people understand what radioisotope dating is, what the assumptions are. And an example of assumptions are you have to assume what the starting point is.
Correct,
They would start out with zircons, and they assumed that there was no radiogenic lead in the zircons when it was formed.
Right.
Well, how do you know? You have to go back in time to when the volcano blew up or whatever.
Like Ken Ham saying, were you there?
Were you there? And so they make these assumptions that there was no radiogenic lead in it, and we can probably make as creationists, our belief was that yes, there was. There was probably quite a bit of that in the zircons.
Right.
So, and the thing that was really brought out by the radioisotope and the Age of the Earth project, the RATE project they call it.
Oh yeah. Was Curt Sewell involved in that or not?
I think he had a hand in it. I think he passed away in the early 2000s.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I was very lucky enough to talk with him and exchange a lot of information with him. He put his stuff on my website, but his book was called God at Ground Zero.
Okay.
Because he was there at Ground Zero of the Trinity
the
site
Manhattan Project. Wow.
when they first exploded the first atomic bomb. And of course, that was a public relations nightmare, because they had to explain this huge fireball that took place out in the middle of the White Sands, Alamogordo area, and they explained that it was an ammunition dump.
Really? That's one heck of an ammunition dump.
He says, yeah, he was the chief engineer of the Isotopes Incorporated, and several of his top staff members had PhDs, and there was a few others who were Wheaton College graduates and Christians who believed in progressive creation, and so there was a lot of different things that they went back and forth on, and he ended up becoming a born again Christian, but they some of these compromised Christians that he was working with were trying to make have one foot in the Bible and one foot in the world, and so he started studying technical journals and books, and finally he was convinced that the circular logic and faith in prior beliefs played a huge part in the radioisotope dating. And so it wasn't a scientific fact provable by scientific methods. There was too much unproved belief involved. And so he became open to considering a young Earth creationist worldview.
How early on did that happen, do you know?
Okay, that was probably back in the 60s and 70s.
Back when the Genesis flood may have been coming out?
Right, yeah.
Because, I mean, that was, 61 when that came out? 60,
Right, yeah.
I think, something like that.
So this guy was an early adopter of the creation message, and I give him credit for trying to search out the truth and figure out these things for himself, and not just take offhand the ideas that were proposed by that.
Did you ever meet him in person?
I never met him in person, but
I wish I would've.
we kept exchanging emails and letters. I think he actually wrote to me and sent all his packet of stuff in the mail.
Wow. Okay, wow.
And then, of course, the first time I heard of John Sanford is when he called me up.
So this is the next guy on our list, right?
Yeah, he is actually a very well-known geneticist, and he was the inventor of the gene gun. And so he's the guy that we have to thank for all the genetically modified organisms that are out there, the GMOs.
Oh, which a lot of people have a big lot to get, but GMO is like a lot of stuff is just pipe.
Basically what it is, what this is doing is grafting.
Yeah.
And it's just, and he has this technique that takes certain genetic information from one organism and piggybacking it on another one to produce this sort of thing.
I think a lot of people think genetically, like they're zapping with
we're creating mutations.
We're creating mutations, and that when I read about it, I go, that's not anything. That's like it's hybridization. A lot of it. I mean, in putting things together. And of course, I'll say, well, maybe
it's finding out, and a lot of people have problems with genetically modified corn, like for example, which resists the Roundup.
Oh yeah.
And so then they can pile all the Roundup on it. Well, the Roundup we're finding out is pretty bad for you. Yeah. There's a lot of connections to that with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Because anytime we mess with God's original creation and do stuff, but his thing is just shifting the genetics around and taking what God has created and combining certain things together to...
because I have to admit, I do like the new sweet corn where they got the kind of white and yellow. Oh man, that's the best corn in the crop there is, man. And it's better than stuff I had when I was... when I first got it, I looked a little askance at it, Doug. I go, this is kind of a modeled kind of thing, and it doesn't look as good as it. Why is it can't be perfectly yellow like it used to be? And then I ate some and I go, holy mackerel, this is pretty good. This is really tasty. This is much tastier than the corn I used to have.
Now what's interesting is Dr. Jerry Bergman, who helped me on both of these books, he explained one time to me about the corn and jumping genes. And it's the jumping genes which travel from one chromosome to another one, and it actually provides a whole bunch of different variety. And so it's sort of like we're going to make something that's a little bit modeled here, and the colored corn, all the ones with all the colors.
Yeah.
Well, it's because of jumping genes, and it's because this particular dark color and the yellow color and all these different colors are coming out through the same organism.
Yeah.
To the ear of corn, and it's making all this variety. And so basically what John Sanford has done with the gene gun is to figure out how that works, and then make it possible for the crops to have that have all this
Well, the
variety.
variety. No, you got something here listed, evolutionary utopian vision under John Sanford. What does that mean?
All right, let me read this because I think that really gives you a picture of how that came about with him. Yeah, basically, he had a guy who he said up to a certain time, evolution was just a cold fact of science to me, like the fact that the world is round or that all people must die. But this friend's vision was so much better. Evolution was not just random chances to changes through time filtered by selection. Instead, it was essentially a purpose-driven process of self-creation, the one and only noble thing, which should be continued at all costs. Evolution was leading us toward the cosmic destiny of the universe, and humans were a stepping stone toward ultimate intelligence, self-understanding, and power. In the end, man, or whatever evolved from him, would eventually reverse entropy, death, and cosmic degeneration, resulting in a perfect, immortal universe. And scientists like us would help lead the way.
Oh, yeah.
Well, so this is the thing that he bought into this whole evolutionary thing, hook, like a sinker. He liked this romantic idea of evolution, and he would push hard for it in his classes, and he would, during those years, he never dreamed that he ever become a Christian.
Let alone a creationist.
And what happened to him was that he was starting to have some crises in his marriage, and he ended up reluctantly going with his wife to church, and it seemed like, and he found out this love of Christ permeated everything that they were doing in the church, and it was fascinating to him, but though his flesh rebelled against it, and finally, like I said, he was challenging God. Show me the evidence, I'll believe. And God says, believe, and I'll show you the evidence. And so what happened was that he says, I'm going to make this commitment, and we'll see. And it's sort of like what I did when I was young. I said, God, this is an experiment. I'm going to go with your plan all the way, just to see what happens, and I'm going to conduct my life in the manner that I believe that you are calling me to be. And there was all this evidence that followed that decision. And that's what happened to John Sanford. I was invited by him to go to San Diego in 2006.
Okay.
And they had what they called the Gene Conference. And there they did several different projects. One, they compared ape DNA and human DNA with this whole thing with chimpanzees are 98% human.
Oh, yeah.
And so we've studied that, and there is also a computer simulation that they were doing that was really fascinating of trying to of the odds of creating life in a test tube. And, and that's the reason why they
you know all about that.
Yeah, he contacted me because I was involved with that, and also had a few computer skills.
Okay.
It turns out that their program was a bit more sophisticated than what I could participate in, but it was, but at that gene conference, there was people like Kevin Anderson and Walter Remine, a lot of these luminaries, Wesley Brewer, John Beale, these guys were people that he invited from all over the country to discuss this whole genetic information, and that's where he came up with this book about genetic entropy, where all these different people, evolutionists, realize that accumulation of mutations is such a bad thing. You can have a lot of near neutral stuff.
Yeah.
But you also, you know, this was sort of like if you change a letter or two in a book, you can read the book because of the context. But you know, there's also sometimes where a genetic mutation is really fatal. It changes the whole meaning, and it
Yeah, and then they also have what's called genetic load. Over time, you keep building up even near neutral that are not really deleterious in a major way. Over time, it begins to accumulate, and it causes, you know, ultimately, if you keep changing the letters, you get nonsense. You can't get it. You can't read the book. You wouldn't be able to read it. And even worse, you start flipping letters upside down or backward and deleting things and leaving the. Pretty soon, you got a gobbledygook, and so no communication levels. Life could not exist. And so, is that what he's talking about there, kind of?
Right.
Yeah.
And you've got that book, The Biotic Message by Walter Remine.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I read first and gave it to you. And that's a tome of information of
Yeah.
how, and that's the first time that I heard that the DNA molecule is actually a computer program in 4 dimensions.
Yeah. Time.
And you know,
Height,
we have
depth.
and it has all these different dimensions that have meaning. You have a normal computer program that is sort of linear, but it has information that you read like you would a book, whereas this the X and Y and the Z axis all have meaning. And it's this 3-dimensional shape that causes it to have meaning and do stuff in the body. And
Well, Doug, we got 3 more guys to get through. We only got 5 minutes. Are we gonna be able to do this or not?
Well, we can do some of these a little bit more, but I did want to talk about David Bradbury because he was from the Detroit area, and so for a long time he hosted our TV show in Bloomfield Hills.
Yeah.
And so but he's gone now, but he was given a challenge by John Grebe, who was a director of research at Dow Chemical Company, and it was $1,000 challenge to find empirical evidence for evolution.
Okay.
And so he took up this challenge, and he says, "Oh, that should be pretty easy." Well, it turned out turning him around.
Yeah. Wow.
And so he was, one of the things he talks about is what he calls hypothetical deductive science. And that is where he takes it, you physically have to be able to test something. From the physically untestable hypothesis, you mentally draw secondary deductions that can be physically tested. Then you test all these deductions, not the hypothesis itself, and do this for as many deductions as possible. So you have to follow all the rabbit trails of what could possibly happen. As more deductions are successfully tested, the validity of the hypothesis becomes stronger.
Yeah.
And then finally it can be accepted. But that's the type of science he talked about. Of course, you and I went and visited Dr. Raymond Damadian, the inventor of the MRI. His story is in this book. And he says he took a new process called nuclear magnetic resonance that was a method of identifying chemistry, and was able to expand it to the point where you could put a human being in it, and that became the MRI. And he was the very first person to invent the MRI, but he says that the creation played a leading role in his science and inventions.
And also, it's why he got refused the Nobel Prize, or what was it?
Yeah, the creationism is politically incorrect to the point where it played a factor in him getting turned down for the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, he should have had it, but, you know, he's a great guy. He's a great guy, yeah.
And lastly, we have Frank Sherwin, who we met just a couple weeks ago.
Yep.
And he was at a church down in Ypsilanti. He's a parasitologist. And so...
Study of parasites.
So he was actually giving a nice little presentation down there. And one of the things in his presentation that stood out for me is that Francis Crick, who was one of the guys who discovered the genetic code, the DNA molecule,
Right.
He says, you have to be reminded that what we see in molecular biology is not designed, but rather evolved.
Yeah.
You have to remind yourself, you know, this was not designed.
It was random.
It was random, it was evolution.
Accidental.
And then Frank says that all science is creation science. You have to have, in order for it to be scientific, it has to be placed in the context of God's creation.
It's like Dawkins' thing, when he said, oh yeah, he was trying to show up at Michigan State why an airplane's wing is designed and a bird's wing was random.
Yeah.
And I said, boy, that did not play at all. I mean, the bird wing is so much more complicated. It reminds me of that when you're talking about Frank Sherwin talking about that. We have to remind ourselves that this is not designed when everything around you screams design. Yep.
And so I hope that you pick up these books. You can go to our website, rae.org, and order them from us. And we'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.